I'm honored and delighted to be here, and always to being particularly invited by students of comparative literature. As I told you, the ones that were out last night. All my studies have been in comparative literature from the very beginning. A very complex, problematic field is something I care a great deal about. A lot of the work I do, I think would not have been done had I not this training, I think. I was asked to talk about something that is sort of in progress. So I chose this piece, which is it is definitely in progress, but it's more work than some of the other things. It was presented at it was with a third of the part of it, at the third of the 3 state library lectures, but I took it out of the book. The book is coming out in a month or so, called Lessons in Secular Criticism. It includes 2 of the lectures plus a whole lot of other material, some of which I've been writing in a kind of more or less journalistic fashion. So it's a book that is a kind of both an overview and a prelude of this project, which I started in about more than 10 years ago, and is now kind of getting split up. The Perils of the One, which is where this is from, and it's the last essay in this book, is a series of essays that cover quite a range. From, let's say, thinking about the problem of power or non-power in so-called primitive societies, to the obsession of contemporary philosophers with Pauline theology, to the epistemology of sexual difference. And it's what it is all the essays come together in their interrogation of what I've been calling monarchical thinking, which isn't to say, obviously, adhering to royalty, but it is the kind of thinking that ultimately, whatever its contours might be, however it presents itself, ultimately goes back to a singular arche, right? A singular point of authority, origin, and rule. So, and this happens in various historical contexts. So it is called Evolutionist Idolatry, and the essay itself, it's actually sort of in 4 parts. The first part is a very, very brief account of the problem of political theology as a problem. I don't go into it in detail, but I will read it because I think it's going to be an interesting discussion for us. It's very short. Then there's a discussion on the problem of monotheism, reading through Freud primarily and Jan Assmann, but I'm not going. That's not done. So it's not going to be. But I can talk about it. You can see how. Then the part on idolatry and prohibition, which I will read, and then another part. It concludes with a short section on theatricality, which I use as a kind of alternate concept to idolatry, prohibition, monotheism, and so on. So just to give you an idea of the contours of this, it would be very long essay when it's done. Okay. Since the term political theology established itself fully in the academic theoretical scene, and I wouldn't quite date it with the advent of the Carl Schmitt obsession, but rather with the secularism obsession, which emerged about 10 years ago, the term which it overtook and silenced was not political theory, as Paul Kahn argues in his recent book, Political Theology, 4 New Chapters on the Concept of Sovereignty, but rather political economy. The eclipse of political economy as a primary interpretive concept is all the more stunning given the dire circumstances of our day, when the economic sphere has come to occupy the political in undisguised fashion. While we have come to understand, after Marx, that economic interests ultimately determine the political trajectory of societies, we have now come to see economic agents explicitly exercising governmental power, not only according to the well-documented control, say, of American government officials by Wall Street lobbyists, but even the appointment of unelected trained bankers or financial managers to positions of heads of state. In Greece and Italy are the recent examples. Such is the state of what, especially after the American constitutional precedent of Citizens United, signifies what I've been calling the deregulation of the political. Both names, Citizens United and the deregulation of the political, are absurd. The first one is relentlessly sarcastic and even cruel. The Supreme Court of the United States has legalized the annihilation of citizenship by legislating the economic determination of the citizen, as opposed to the political one. My naming is just ironic. Deregulation has always been, even in strict economic terms, about specific, partial and stealth, but nonetheless hardcore regulation. In other words, invisible rules in the name of no rules, whose benefit is not only to maximize control of the game by those who gain from it, but exterminate those who oppose them. So in a context where the economics is exercising explicit regulation of the sphere of the political, while simultaneously facing political economy from the language of social and historical analysis, it seems even more problematic to me that the political is ever more thought to be determined by the theological. It's not only that the famous Carl Schmitt quotation, all significant concepts of the modern theory of the state are secularized theological concepts, we know that, seems to be circulated ad absurdum as fact. It is that even in its own terms, Schmitt's dictum has been irresponsibly considered. To say that something has been secularized, grammatically speaking, is to mean that an action has been taken upon this something, and that this something, the theological, has thereby been altered. Secularization is an alteration of the forms and conditions of the theological, which isn't to say the annihilation of the theological, but it is neither to say the mere repetition of the theological in other guise. While we're fond of saying that history repeats itself, it most brutally doesn't. And it is precisely history as finite action that makes even the apparent repetition of form in actuality a shift from tragedy to farce, what have you. As elementary as this point is, it is indicative of a profound lapse in the proliferation of Schmitt's dictum in the present secularism debates. From this standpoint, although theological elements continue to abound in contemporary societies worldwide, they're neither primary in some sort of a priori hierarchy of determination, nor have they always existed in strict historical terms, all the more so in relation to the political. As a concept, historically speaking, political theology is a Christian notion. Though the name is first encountered in Stoic philosophy, it is given there simply the significance of one category of politics among many, and by that token, the theological is merely an account of specific elements of service to statescraft. It is only when the Roman Empire refashions itself as a theologically endowed regime under Emperor Constantine that the term begins the trajectory we are now debating. Eusebius of Caesarea, who lived in the mid-3rd century, who is the first historian of Christianity, is also the first to fashion the idea that the transportation and transformation of Roman Imperium to Byzantium is the historical-political actualization of what is theologically announced in the biblical text. He's the first one to make that argument. There is an intricate nexus here, especially the relation of Eusebius' position with the theological arguments about God's Trinitarian consubstantiality that brought about the decisions of the Council of Nicaea 325, which formed the theological and legislative foundations of Christianity until the schism in the 11th century. Especially significant is the famous dictum of Gregory of Nazianzus in his 3rd theological oration, published 379 AD, right? That the Trinitarian arche consists in the notion, I quote, of the one being in stasis with itself. To en stasiazon pros αυτό. Stasis, this peculiar Greek word, right? That means the phrase, if it were to be translated, would have to be translated simultaneously as the one standing beside itself or along with itself, and at the same time, the one rebelling or warring against itself. Okay? Simultaneously, though, you can't take one over the other. So this extraordinary notion, not only as the epitome of the Christian theological imaginary, and altogether explicitly of how political theology is necessarily monarchical, but also more broadly in its equally explicit contradistinction from the ancient Greek philosophical and political vocabulary that enables it to begin with, because stasis has a huge tradition in ancient Greek democratic politics, particularly, I can talk about later. However, it is in the hands of Augustine, as is well known, that the horizon of political theology is enhanced with a transcendental teleology, the substance of which has yet to be conceptually outmaneuvered. The city of God is still in the last instance, telos, right? It is still, the last instance, the telos of political theology, whatever name might be invented for it in the course of time in the various social historical languages deployed. As last instance, philosophically speaking now, the transcendental civitas Dei is the limit point of the concept of political theology, making in this sense the political ultimately subordinate to the theological, an instrument of the theological, as is after all grammatically all too evident. Political is just an adjective to the substantive theology that it qualifies. From a historical standpoint, however, political theology is to be understood from the outset, long before Carl Schmitt came to exist upon this earth, as theology grounded and constituted against an enemy. This enemy would have to have both theological and political dimensions, although this is not to say that the two are necessarily dialectically entwined. The political history of Christianity is exemplary as a political history of the concept of enmity, and has come to infect its historical enemies with the same logic. While the transcendentalist element in political theology is thus outmaneuverable and primary, the usage of political theology in different epochs, including our present time, testifies simultaneously to its insurmountably worldly character. The discursive space of political theology in this respect is the realm of the political, even when the discussion that ensues is resolutely theological. Thinking from the nodal perspective of this naming, two crucial sets of questions emerge that need to be asked. These two sets of questions are of a different order, but are indeed linked by a demand to focus our interpretation on the political of the two, right? The first question, is theology necessarily political? That is, can we speak of an apolitical theology? And what would this mean? How could apolitical possibly stand on its own, that is undetermined by the political? And moreover, can we really speak of theology as such, unqualified, substantial? If the answer is no to any one of the last two questions, then the emphasis in the original question inevitably falls on the issue of necessity. Is theology necessarily political? This, I believe, is the bottom line in the discussion of what might be signified by the name political theology and its uses. If indeed this is the case, we need to ask, what are the terms of this necessity? What authorizes it? My tendency would be to say that such terms cannot be merely theological, strictly speaking. That is, we cannot speak of an internal history of political theology as a formal philosophical concept, the way physicists do about their concepts. In the last instance, political theology is an instrumental logic. The second question, what is the politics enacted by political theology? Can we speak of a politics in this paradoxical singular plural way, that is to say of a certain kind of politics, and in an eidos of politics, which can nonetheless be manifested differently according to historical specifics? All the more so given that political theology remains articulated unquestionably in the singular. Indeed, this in fact begs the question. The question of whether political theology is monological or not is for me an outmaneuverable dimension of the problem. We cannot assume an agreement on this issue, but we cannot go ahead without seriously encountering it as a question. If in fact political theology enacts a specific politics regardless of the theological or historical content, then a whole other can of worms is open. I venture on an answer by conviction, but also for the sake of argument. Schmitt is again a crucial reference point. I've always argued that Schmitt's notion of sovereignty as decision on the exception entails a monarchical theory. Literally speaking, not a reference to royalty. And I hold this despite his argument in the Verfassungslehre, which is a whole other discussion. Certainly in Political Theology, his book, 1922, a purely juridical book, with these words, by the way, Schmitt conceives sovereignty explicitly as singular arche, and it's elementary to say that the radical democratic imaginary that honors Aristotle's dictum that no ruler can rule without the knowledge of being ruled and vice versa, which is a veritable anarchic position, I've argued this elsewhere, could not possibly be entertained in the Schmittian universe. But I would go further and argue that this literally monarchical element permeates all post-Hobbesian theories of sovereignty, including those advocating popular sovereignty, like Paul Kant's, that see the sovereign position as extra-dimensional of the polity. In this sense, one could paraphrase Schmitt's famous dictum in Political Theology to say instead that all significant concepts of the modern theory of the state are residual monarchical concepts. This might give us a better sense of why I assert that political theology has meaning only within a monarchical, that is to say monological, monomythical, and indeed monotheistic imaginary. Alternately stated, but within the same logic, to the extent that it acts politically, theology always obeys a monarchical logic, following thus a long historical trajectory of theologizing the monarchical principle of archaic societies, so much so that monarchy has become a quintessential theological term. Understand how this just gets kind of in a loop. In this specific sense, Schmidt's dictum signifies precisely the opposite of what it denotes. Let us remember that Schmidt writes his second political theology treatise practically 50 years later, 1970. Not at all as a sequel, despite the name. It's Political Theology 2, but it's really not a sequel. But as a response to his critics, primarily to a long essay by Catholic theologian Eric Peterson, written in 1935, 1970, on monotheism as a political problem. We've got to keep in mind the dates here, very important. The date and the specific focus point to a response to the monarchical principle of the monarchical dogma, the Führer principle. I think this is really what's going on in Peterson, which actually Schmidt acknowledges, but not quite in this way. And secondarily, the second response is to Hans Blumenberg's contemporary critique in the legitimacy of the modern age, which eventually was released in 1976, but the text had already been published before. It is actually, I believe, the second. I think it's Blumenberg that authorizes Schmidt's impetus to take on the first Peterson, thereby expressly staging an argument with the theologian as a political rather than theological matter. If monotheism is a political problem, according to Peterson, Schmidt seems to suggest that political theology is not about monotheism, which is a shrewd shift of the framework of argument and very typical of Schmittian tactics. Hence, he predicates his argument on the assertion, and I quote, that political theology is a polymorphous phenomenon with two different sides to it, each directed to its specific concepts. This is already given in the compositum of the phrase. There are many political theologies because there are, on the one hand, many different religions, and on the other, many different kinds and methods of doing politics. This is Schmidt. Now, one doesn't suddenly discover a relativist Schmidt. So this passage requires an equally shrewd reading. I would draw our attention to the centrality of the word compositum. I've always found insightful the assessment of the great German playwright Heiner Müller that Schmidt's thinking is exemplarily theatrical. He's a polemical thinker, for some the thinker of the political. He's a political thinker. That was a slip, but it was perfect. And simultaneously, though, in a furtive way, for many reasons, driven by a theological desire. The two are in constant agonistic relation, the political and theological. The compositum is precisely the staging of this agonism disguising a compromise formation. You'll see why I use this term later. Although a concept delineated in the singular, as a kind of Begriffsgeschichte kind of thing, political theology for Schmidt becomes by the 1970s a performative domain, which thereby, by virtue of its very performativity, is articulated as the work of myth. This is what he says. Schmidt explicitly applauds Peterson's suggestion that political theology is a myth, albeit by turning against Peterson's negative signification of the notion of myth. Without invoking Georges Sorel, whose work he knows profoundly, Schmidt essentially adopts here a Sorelian notion of political theology as the myth necessary for the specific socio-historical and political, his language juridical, action he demands in most of his post-World War II writings, from Nomos of the Earth onward. The problem that needs in-depth investigation, and obviously I'm not doing it here, is in what sense this mythical performative, even in Schmidt's staging of political theology too, can outmaneuver the transcendentalist imperative of a politics that desires to be theological above and beyond all, a politics that by virtue of this untamable desire can never be democratic. Monotheism is a political problem first and foremost, although not in terms that Peterson and Schmidt can adequately handle. So this is really my kind of introduction of political theology as a problem, in order then, and as a kind of monarchical way of thinking, in order then to proceed to argue the discussion of monotheism in Freud, and then the stuff on the prohibition of images. So I'm now going to the other part of the text that's about the title. So for years I've been fascinated by a couple of sentences in Cornelius Castoriadis' essay, Institution of Society and Religion, which was published initially in 1980. And the quotation is the following: "Every religion is idolatry or is not socially effective religion. In religion, words themselves, sacred words, function and can only function as idols." Okay, this is the phrase that is the point of this meditation. Now, this unequivocal phrase, "every religion is idolatry," comes with an explicit qualification, "or is not socially effective religion," thereby underscoring religion as a societal, indeed we might even say political issue, rather than as a theological problem. In this sense, the mysticism that might produce an abyssal language in which no idols remain standing can never be by definition socially effective, a social binding force. Mystical practice configures instead a social unbinding, a rejection of society, and aims at its most extreme at the incapacity of worldly assembly. This isn't to say that the unintelligibility of mystical language is not socially readable, okay? As after all, Michel de Certeau, his name is shown us in his work, I think is extraordinary in this ground. It is to say that however society might be able to read this unintelligibility, to come to terms with it, it nonetheless cannot but turn it into an idol, thereby turn it against it, read it as another language by another language. A quote from the Castoriadis text now: "The mystical relation to the abyss, whether it be authentic or hallucinatory phenomenon, does not matter here. There never was and there never will be a mystical religion or a religion of mystics. The lives of mystics themselves function as instituted simulacra of the abyss." End quote. How often socially effective religion has turned mysticism into dangerous idolatry, even while bestowing sanctification to specific practitioners, is one of the key indications of how far it goes to deny its own idolatrous investment. This sentence will make sense in terms of my argument. Castoriadis' unambiguous signification of religion in this fashion is actually the result of thinking about representation against the grain of traditional use. For Castoriadis, a quote, "The need for religion corresponds to the refusal on the part of human beings to recognize absolute alterity." Okay, end of quote. This is primarily an ontological problem, but the question of capacity or incapacity of encounter with alterity is entirely a matter of social imaginary institution. I should clarify, even if absurdly briefly, that in Castoriadis' language, absolute alterity is an immanent, not a transcendental position. This is expressed in twofold fashion. Again, this is really schematic, but we can discuss it more. On the one hand, alterity is literally internal. It's a radical otherness within a self, who is forever torn between the compulsion for self-reproduction, which is identity, right? And the necessity for internalizing the resolute otherness of the world, which Castoriadis terms self-alteration, which this has a lot of psychoanalytic components, obviously, we can talk about. On the other hand, it is precisely the second, a radical otherness of the world, a radical otherness pertinent to the world as a natural substratum, which is immanent because it rests, because upon it rests every imaginary institution of society, even if this imaginary institution is not determined by it. That is to say, there is no causal relation in Castoriadis between nature and society. No causal relation. It's not that there is no relation. There is no causal relation. Even if without a specific biochemical molecular structure, human beings would not exist. So even though without nature, the human world, the social world would not exist, there's nonetheless there's no causal relation. Okay? This is his way of, essentially kind of pre-Socratic, but we can go into that later. While the first of these two components, the psychical one, is ontological at the level of the living being, the second, the world component, is always configured according to the specific social imaginary at work. If this immanent radical otherness exists at the level of physis, right, nature, both at the psychical and the cosmological level, it becomes the reason why, in the world of the human living being at least, physis must be divided by nomos. There cannot be nature without law. Okay? Not the law of nature. I want to make sure that's clear. It's when, in fact, nomos is presented as physis. It's when law is presented as natural that we run into these problems. Okay? That's, in fact, part of my argument about idolatry and the production of the sacred is that. Okay. Now, responding to this existential predicament, society produces a compromise formation that emerges out of the refusal to recognize absolute immanent alterity so as to cover over this refusal, so as to fill its void, and in this respect, unwittingly, to fulfill it. Before the so-called secularization process takes place, this fulfillment of the refusal of abyssal alterity that produces a precisely circumscribed and socially meaningful alterity accounts for what he calls religion. Okay. Religion then is instituted in order to counter the abyssal terrain of being, the fact that there's nothing in human existence that presupposes it, hypostasizes it, or exceeds it, that human existence is at the limit groundless, and all established signification, beyond the one that it creates itself, fails it. This abyssal condition is, of course, unrepresentable, unlocalizable, and meaningless. And we can talk about how we invent languages to account for this, psychoanalysis being one of the great ones that, without us knowing, we actually stipulate what the infant is in that kind of blissful world of non-differentiation and so on. But these are languages, including the language of ontology, they're language of invention. So I'm skipping a bit in order to move on. One may raise a counter-argument that this essentially ontological signification of religion, because it is really kind of talking in terms of general anthropology, okay, remains silent about the social historical emergence of the very concept or name religion. This name, the counter-argument goes, might be said to be inscribed with the secularization claim and all its politics, namely, the geopolitical establishment of Christianity as the world's dominant religion, which claims to go beyond religion, so as to emancipate itself from that constraint, while relegating every other such mode to it. Right? This is the argument that people make on this ground. For those who make the latter argument, it's in a broad range of ways, from Marcel Gauchet to Talal Asad, from Tomoko Masuzawa to Gil Anindjar, the question of secularization is, in a sense, false or deceptive. A ruse by which Christianity erases itself as religion in order to establish the realm of religion for all others. Well, I think this argument has merit and, in fact, a great deal of historical accuracy. It is ultimately short-sighted and indeed compromised by its unwillingness to consider the essential animating force of what has been called secularization, namely, the desire of some human beings to relieve themselves of their self-imposed constraints and confront the consequences of encountering the cosmological abyss without safeguards. Whether or how far this desire has been actualized is not an issue. Secularization, and I've been arguing this for years, is unfinishable by definition. The cosmological abyss cannot be encountered once and for all. So although one could again raise the counter-argument that all kinds of other safeguards were indeed put into place as a result of secularization. Constitutions, nations, ideologies, scientific truths, or utopian dreams, the fact remains that all those new so-called delusions ushered by secularization were acknowledged to be human creations, for better or worse, thereby shifting the knowledge framework so as to enable the thought that religion too could be understood as a human creation. You understand? For me, that's the key element about secularization. It's actually an epistemic shift, and it has nothing to do with whether the world has been secularized a little bit, a lot, or at all. That's not the issue. It's how we actually look at everything as a result. Okay. Even if secularization can be disputed as having occurred at all, whether according to Schmidt's argument or the work of the thinkers I just mentioned, this shifting in the framework of knowledge cannot be disputed. Regardless of the persistence of the faithful, the world around, some number among the world's population, and indeed impossible to measure precisely, we don't know how many, understands that religion is one glorious, if sometimes perilous, human creation among men. In the end, what one thinks of secularization is secondary. Religious practices under different names seem to have existed in all societies in known history, even if their exact domain of significance is both enormously varied and inordinately contested. As one category of social formation among many, which is, I think, what secularization enables, religion is at this point an epistemological domain in itself. This is to say, it is religion as a categorical, perhaps cognitive framework that enables the recognition and naming of a certain typology of practices we call religious, not the other way around. And if this distinction is itself a symptom of the secularization process, even that doesn't matter. Or rather, it is a matter of historical understanding, of an emergent horizon of perception that enables the recognition of religion as a human creation. And here I'm not going to quote, because the quote is long and very well known, from Marx's famous passage in the introduction to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, where he's talking about that human beings make religion, religions make human beings. You remember that, and that religion is really one of those fantastic realizations of human essence, because there is no human essence, etc. It's really wonderful to go back to those things. I know they've been criticized, but it's humanist texts, but they're great. So I'm not going to elaborate on this text, but what Marx calls irreligious criticism is precisely what recognizes humanity's reality to be a concrete manifestation, a poetic, creation, a kind of poesis, of confronting its groundlessness or its abyssal essence. Human essence has no true reality, he says, no ground other than itself, which is why whatever it is, it derives this capacity to be from its phantasmatic propensity to imagine, create, and realize what we call historical realities. That these realities shape or form and thereby make specific modes of human being, it's a kind of condition, does not mean that they create humanity in some ontological fashion, no matter the voluminous myths of such creation or all kinds of cultural traditions over time. Okay, now, so as human creation, religion is basically a social practice of encountering and concealing the abyss of existence. What Castoriadis calls socially effective religion for him is the only meaning of religion, is the outcome of creating a name, a representation, a locus for this abyss of interminable self-created otherness. Though such creations are often concrete material objects, icons, statues, totems, sacred texts, they're equally likely, and often more powerfully, to be abstract and immaterial. The Word become flesh, the Trinitarian substance, the unpronounceable name of God, the 99 names of God, the unrepresentable as such, the transcendental absolute, the goddess reason. I mean, it doesn't have to, we can go on, right? Christ himself is called by Paul the image of the invisible God, kon to Theou to aoratu. And it's worth noting that this very phrase, ikon Theou, right, image of God, that with this very phrase, Philo of Alexandria argues for the merits of a unified logos against polytheism. In any case, whatever their names, such social imaginary creations that constitute the space of the sacred are idols, reified simulacra of the abyss they represent and at the same time conceal. This is the statement of every religion is idolatry. This is the meaning of the statement, every religion is idolatry. To the extent that religion is not merely the representation of society's desire to ritualize its existence and not restricted to an individual's mystical claim to merge with the abyss, but is instead the institution that occludes the groundlessness of existence as such and thus builds an imaginary institutional scaffolding on which society might find rest, then the workings of religion are essentially psychical, I don't mean psychological, and indeed not unlike those of sublimation, whereby all invested representations are categorically objectified, be they images, words, or cognitive abstractions. We've got to remember that sublimation is not investment in objects as such, not just, but in words and so on, in abstractions as well. Those are objects. This is why for Castoriadis, idolatry is at work even in those cases when religion emerges from the foundational monotheistic injunction, the prohibition of images that be verboten. Certainly, in historical terms, idolatry would not even exist as a concept without this monotheistic injunction. I quote here from Tom Mitchell, who's of course written, as you may know, a lot about this subject. Idolatry is a word that mainly appears in the discourse of iconoclasm. This is Tom Mitchell, okay? Idolatry is a word that mainly appears in the discourse of iconoclasm, a militant monotheism obsessed with its own claims to universality. There is no idolatry without an iconoclasm to label it as such, since idolaters almost never call themselves by that name. Mitchell gets another obvious but crucial historical dimension that is unacknowledged in theological philosophical discussions, though actually Freud makes it explicit in Muslim monotheism. Namely, since the initial biblical injunction, the iconoclastic prohibition is directly linked to territorial claims, either in terms of exclusionary defensiveness or expansionist conquest, almost always expressing itself with annihilating violence. A quote again from Mitchell: "The practical enforcement of the ban on images involves destroying the sacred sites of the native inhabitants." End of quote. Perhaps because the notion and name of idolatry exists as the hate-filled repressed core of its own prohibition, this would have to be this academic argument, it is animated, in Mitchell's words, by a surplus, I quote again, a moral panic that seems completely in excess of legitimate concerns about something called graven images, which inspires all-out gestures of erasure, desire to annihilate all traces of people and cultures backward and forward in time, and is implicitly genocidal. Okay, this is understanding how idolatry works at the heart of iconoclasm is key to unraveling the profound influence of the Bildverbot as the most prevalent all-around social command, arche, in today's world. In order to succeed, the exercise of the Bildverbot, which conventionally may have had Hebraic origins, but remains the core principle in all monotheistic imaginaries, even if performed on extreme occasions, early Christian monophysites, Byzantine iconoclasm, Franciscan or Calvinist asceticism, strict Islamism, Protestant fundamentalism. It has a lot of faces. Okay, I want to make sure that we keep this in mind. Must involve a rather narrow construct of image in its most literal sense. Bild essentially comes to define the object of representation as such, as an object that must be identified, known, and forbidden by virtue of representation, as representation. Nominally, the prohibition is against images that dare to represent God, if only because they will then be endowed with divine properties in themselves and worshipped as such as divine objects, idols. But underneath this nominal logic, what is really prohibited is the very act, the very conception of representation, the daring to give God a form, since in the monotheistic imaginary at least, only God forms, or better yet, God is form, and the only agency of form, of which humans are thereby the exemplary byproduct. This is expressly denoted in the extraordinary notion of human being, condition, formed in God's image and God's likeness. The Greek words translating the Hebrew of Genesis are ikon, image or icon, and homeosis, sameness, likeness, which may be thought of insofar as it has always been invoked polemically against paganism as the explicit rollback of anthropomorphic divinities, by nonetheless absorbing the principle of icon and likeness, and thereby, in a kind of Hegelian sense, preserving it by altering the core principle. Namely, if God is form, then the project of human formation is theomorphic. Yet, the human being cannot ultimately tolerate itself as God, or godlike, thereby projecting backward an anthropomorphic notion to the category of God, who may not necessarily look like the statue of Zeus as it would have been sculpted by Praxiteles or Phidias, but is nonetheless imagined, and since the monotheistic imaginary is and can only be a patriarchal imaginary, as the Almighty Father, in however abstract or concrete manifestation of this in a specific social imaginary can handle. There's much to say here in light of this sketch about the validity of Castoriadis' provocative assertion that the institution of religion, I quote, is the supreme hubris of human existence, an ontological hubris, end of quote. It's provocative because the commonsensical assumption is that hubris is committed when human beings believe that they are or act like gods, not when they invent or create gods. But indeed, to imagine gods presiding over the universe is one of the most extraordinary acts of human creation, an ordering of the universe by an agency that hereby becomes conspicuously and conveniently absent. It is hubris precisely in the denial of accountability for this act of radical creation. Now, to imagine a single God, moreover a single God who creates humans in image and in likeness, is an even more formidable ontological hubris, if it is at all semantically possible to produce a quantitative figure of the ontological. Not only does it confer the creation and, of course, meaning of being to an entity of the imagination, but it also authorizes the very category of being, capital, which thus leads to the perverse inversion of subject-object authorization, whereby the subject deliberately objectifies itself in the most outrageous denial of its own accountability for creation. Whereas yet, the object, which is the created God, is now named eternal creator, the ultimate other, the object who has become the subject, okay, the subject without subjectivity, mind you, who moreover proceeds with the monopoly of the means of production of the human as the avowed creator, now configured as creator in image and likeness. Right? This perversely contorted process facilitates outrageous notions of grandeur. Not just the concept of the chosen people absorbed into all secularized or not nationalist imaginaries. There is no nationalism that doesn't have the concept of the chosen people in it somewhere. But the notion that the human, made of or as the face of God, is in the last instance of divine essence, a notion whose consequent psychic energies, I would argue, belie the worst excesses of both humanist ideology and religious fanaticism. This is a stunning performance in the history of the human animal as a living being that renders even the human imagination itself paralyzed before the awe of its achievement. Now, in this respect, the prohibition of images has built into it a powerful injunction against both form and representation as such, an injunction that seems to resurface with extraordinary urgency whenever the desire of humans to aestheticize the universe seems to gain the upper hand. In the process, another big question emerges. What is the relation between Bildung and Bildverbot? This is in many ways a German question, crucial to the development of German philosophy, indeed both a theological and anti-theological strains in it, but it is also a question crucial to the imaginary of modernity. It is well known that in the Critique of Judgment, Kant equates the Hebraic and Islamic Bildverbot with the sublime. On the other side of this stands the equally well-known promise by Nietzsche in the Twilight of the Idols, to touch idols with a hammer as if it were a tuning fork. Both thoughts resonate within the same discursive economy. I take Bildverbot to be the core element underlying the Protestant imaginary, which may be distilled into a notion of Geist without Bild, not merely spirit without image, but spirit that cannot be formed into an image because of an assertion, which is passed from theology to philosophy, that image ultimately despiritualizes matters. The project of Bildung, at least in the way that it was configured in Humboldt's mind, is a worldly project. Self-formation is a process that creates both the human being and the human world. It's not a spiritual quest, except insofar as spirit, Geist, also means mind and intellect. So Freud's Geistigkeit, which may be the only possible redeeming value of Bildverbot within its tradition, and this explicitly against the perils of monotheism. This is a long discussion about monotheism and monotheism, but you can do if you want. Is of course a Bildung. That's what Geistigkeit is. It's a Bildung, a poetic process of forming, of creating form against the prohibition of form. Now, this process, I'm coming to the end because we've gone too long and then we can kind of fill in the gaps. The process is linked to what Castoriadis has named the radical imagination, that is the primary social historical process of enabling the creation of form in advance of those institutions of society charged with reproducing form. So this makes an understanding of the imagination as, and I quote, the power to represent what is not. Okay, that's what it is for him, the power to represent what is not. Which then opens up a way of reconsidering the relation between image and representation so that the first is not in the service of the second. Okay? So, it's not the image as representation, but the image as signification that animates idolatry. This is really my point on which this whole argument hinges. Okay, not the image as representation, but the image as signification that animates idolatry. And of course the animus against it. In this sense then, the modern legacy of the prohibition of images, the Bildverbot, would rest on a reconfiguration of Bild where image would be disengaged from the discourse of representation, precisely because the order of modernity is structured around an explicit desire to create images that configure the heretofore unseen and unknown, images that conceptualize and signify the heretofore inconceivable image that represents nothing that exists prior, the thing which is thereby created into existence, right? The new, that would be the new. In the imaginary of modernity, the image is not only to be disengaged from the discourse of representation, but more so engaged from the standpoint of formation and transformation. Hence the invention of Bildung as nominal repeal of Bildverbot, I would argue, even if remaining steadfast in its orbit, which foregrounded the power of poetic transformation in the language of aesthetic education. The Protestant injunction of sola scriptura, which belongs by definition to the economy of Bildverbot, remains throughout this process one of the most powerful idolatrous gestures in the history of the modern world, reaching beyond the realm of Christianity proper, as it underlines the increasing sacralization of the letter of the law and turns legal texts into the constitutive idols of society around the world, whether self-identified religious or secular. Two more paragraphs. The prohibition of images is a radical notion only when it operates in a desacralized universe. This was, of course, Freud's aspiration. In a monotheistic imaginary, iconoclasm merely reorients idol worship from the utterable and representable to the unutterable and unrepresentable. The prohibition on pronouncing the name of God is indeed an idolatrous act. Disregarding this fact is a grave error, although indicative of the self-denial inherent in the logic of religious iconoclasm. Making the name sacred circumscribes in this gesture of erasure, of voiding, the very abyss thus announced. The sacred prohibition of the name is a name, we know Derrida, an act of naming, of localizing in an immanent sense the abyss that must and does, by virtue of this naming, which is the unnaming of the name, okay, remain shielded. Must remain shielded. Likewise, the ritual of the Eucharist is not idolatrous in the sense often considered, that is, as a remnant of paganism in the evocation of animistic eating of the divine body. Rather, the metaphoric configuration of flesh as bread and blood as wine is secondary idolatry. In my mind, literally a superfluous idolatry, a repetitive pleonasm. The most brilliant and insidious gesture this ritual generates is to conceal the real idolatry at work, the conjured phantasm that God, who otherwise cannot be known, who has no name, who exists in ways unfathomable and unrepresentable, can indeed be part of you. In other words, the ritual of ingesting God into one's being, even if altogether metaphorically, reveals precisely God's idol status, which is his real, that is to say, actual status. In this case, the status of an idol that claims to destroy all idols, or perhaps all other idols, would be, of course, the precise way to phrase it. From this standpoint, the Byzantine iconomachy, like all debates about the Trinitarian hypothesis in early patristic literature, which after all feeds into the iconomachy in the 8th century, is a debate internal to the specific idolatry of Christianity. If we take seriously the notion that signification and not representation resides at the core of idolatrous investment, then the battle between iconolaters and iconoclasts is a bit like Freud's narcissism of petty differences, where the differences are hardly petty, of course, because they pertain to the deepest shared inner core, hence the extraordinary violence. This inner core of the ineffable imago Dei, in its Latin naming, whose representation is in any case impossible by definition, even hence, sorry, I didn't read this right. This inner core of the ineffable imago Dei in its Latin naming, whose representation is in any case impossible by definition, even by the Byzantine iconolaters who had no trouble subscribing theologically to the necessary deformation of the divine image in sacred texts, creates the distortion that becomes a distinctive feature of Byzantine art. So to conclude, These sublime tricks exemplify the work of the sacred in social life, a work that in the last instance must remain secretive, literally a mystery. In contrast, a desacralized universe of meaning reconfigures the meaning of both iconoclasm and the sacred. In a capitalist world, where the image is inevitably linked to the rule of commodities and the tyranny of exchange, iconoclasm does become, in effect, a detheologizing gesture. Such is the meaning of Adorno's notion of utopia as negative representation, for example. It's only then that iconoclasm calls into question the idolatribus as such. The stipulation that in every society there is a last instance that cannot be questioned, and of course cannot be represented. Whatever content this last instance may have, whatever language, symbol, sign, convention, whatever may be identified indeed as the idols of the tribe, it is in fact society's last instance of the sacred. And I want to read now what I go into, I'll stop here. What I go into here is a discussion of contemporary art, basically since Dadaism and onto the situations, Duchamp and onto the situations, but really what I consider to be this extraordinary art of Maurizio Cattelan. I don't know if you know, he's a contemporary artist, where my argument is that iconoclasm in modern art, because it's become so conventional, that's what it is now, Cattelan is the one who does this brilliantly, alerts the spectator to the spectator's idolatrous investment. That's really, where this kind of thing can be conducted in what I call a desacralized universe. That's obviously a term that can be contested. And then I end with a discussion from Rancière's The Future of the Image, where he makes a very interesting argument about the unrepresentable, and he says that that in fact there's no such thing as the unrepresentable, because the humanity's capacity for representation is boundless, is interminable, and in fact the unrepresentable is, he does this really brilliantly, I'm not just simply quoting here, is in fact a representation, and he goes on to talk about it, and my argument, the only addition would be for me to say that one of the most coveted spheres of representation in human history is the notion of nothing, right? That in fact is the one about whose representation whole wars are conducted. Okay? So basically the whole argument here is that representation is really not the language when we're talking about idolatry or the prohibition of images. It's really signification, meaning, and that's why we cannot get stuck on objects, icons, and idols, but have to think of it in terms of words, texts, etc., even things that are, in fact, quote, unrepresented. Okay, I hope that it wasn't too tiring. Thank you for listening. I know it's heavy stuff, so let's lighten it up in some arguments.
There's so much to say.
No, I know.
I'll just take a small point, and I'm sure I'm going to talk again, but a little of what you were saying about the subject-object inversion in terms of creation and the creative is just not just related to Marx circa 1843, but it's almost directly, it sounds to me directly Feuerbach.
Oh, that's interesting.
It's just pure Feuerbach. This is what Feuerbach, the whole essence of Christianity, and is this inversion process where theological discourse is inverted, the object is the subject, and the subject's the object, and it's human beings that create God, who then create a God that creates the human beings also. And Marx, around 1843, as I see him, said enough with this stuff.
Right.
Like the critique of religion in Germany is done, and now we go to the critique of economy. Like that's a,
right.
But the odd thing is, it's not done.
Right.
It just goes on.
That's my point.
And so I'm just like, yeah, how do you?
Yeah, yeah.
It doesn't stop, and that directly goes to the beginning of what I mean, the reflections on Schmidt emerging in the 1920s as this prominent, figure with political theology, and then re-emerging in our post 1989 world as the prominent. I mean, I find it astonishing.
It's astonishing.
That this rather weak thinker who can't write a book that's not fundamentally contradictory and not interesting. Just says one thing.
That's what people love about it.
So the critique of religion doesn't stop. And Marx seemed to be giving the impression that we can move on with that. We can move on with a further critique, but.
Yeah. I mean, there are two ways to, respond to the Marx part. I mean, I think you're right about Feuerbach, and I really need to certainly exclude some point about that. I think that is warranted, since I'm quoting Marx after all. But, well, there are two things to say. One is that, of course, Marx was wrong, as you said, and he was wrong in a very, very concrete way, which we now recognize. That in the sense that he created a theology which he didn't acknowledge, right? Communism as a kind of paradise, eschatological, and that would be one way to account for this error, right? I mean, Marx doesn't want to create metaphysics. He would not. If you told him what are you doing? He would actually not, recognize that that's the error. He didn't. He thought that it's done, so he can proceed to do economy as if there is really, as if this thing is not in play. Therefore, falling right in it and not knowing it. And I think that I think is a kind of a fact. I don't think we can dispute that. But there's also another thing that's kind of curious and more complicated. I don't really know how to talk about it, but because I've been reading these early Marx texts a lot, and I've been teaching them too. Particularly because I'm interested in Gattungswesen as a notion apart from the Marxist stuff in it, meaning alienation of labor. I'm interested in his understanding of the human. And in those texts, he seems to make an argument that the critique of religion is the only critique there is. The opposite, right? That with that, we can really cover everything. And it's really not about Christians and Jews at all, really. These are just names. And so on and so on. So I don't know what to say, and I'm certainly not an Althusserian where I would say, there's a break, and I don't believe in that. But there's no doubt about the fact that as we get involved in economy, and political economy becomes a language, it's kind of interesting to consider what I said in the beginning. I hadn't thought of that in this way too. That, because I'm arguing that political economy has been eclipsed, but here what you're making me think is that Marx's political economy eclipses, right, the theological components, and I think that's probably true. Hence the problem of Marxist metaphysics. Well, theological, Marxist theology. Yeah. So I don't know. So obviously, I don't want to call myself a Feuerbach, but yes, there's a bit of that. There's a bit of that in this.
And Feuerbach is a very interesting figure because the
Yeah,
later work
he's been maligned.
is very imminent. It's a certain kind of reflection on water. It's really interested in water and fluids.
I need to do that. I need to look at that stuff again. Yeah. Thank you, actually. Yeah.
I have a very broad and general question.
Mm-hmm.
Regarding the first part of your talk and the underlying project of the non-logical thinking, so to speak, and when we could elaborate a little more on this notion of the monarch, and what you gain by replacing it with the sovereign, which is until today the common language to discuss these matters with the monarch. And I just think of Dante. I mean, that's the only text I could think of, didn't want to hear, where someone actually uses a term to discuss matters like that. And Kantorowicz, we talked about it yesterday, uses Dante, and when I hear the last section of the King's Two Bodies as some almost secular humanist model of the sovereign, so to speak. So the question really was necessarily as a monarch.
Yeah, I mean, look, the word occurs in Aristotle and Plato. It's used literally. I mean, it doesn't refer to a king. Okay, let's make that clear. The word comes to refer to royalty, to kingship. but that's when it first appears. But it's when Plato kind of vents against democracy. One of the things that he worries about is that the people will become one. They will rule as one. That's very interesting. And Plato is an oligarch, so he doesn't want the rule of one. He just wants the rule of the best, the few. So that's a problem. And so Aristotle says the same. He says that does happen. Aristotle doesn't get so upset about it, but he says that monarchos is the word he uses. Demos monarchos. The demos can become a monarch in democracy. It's not inevitable. It doesn't happen. For Plato, it's inevitable. It will happen eventually, and that's why democracy is terrible. But it's not inevitable. But it can happen at any point, and that's one of the problems of democracy. And I think so. I think of monarchy literally as the arche of the one. So one can say, for example, that we the people, right? That phrase. It's a beautiful phrase because it's kind of contradictory. It's singular and plural. To the degree that the phrase tends toward the one, toward unity, which it actually must, in order for there to be the union, right? And the people is understood to be a singular noun. Then this we becomes kind of loses. Then we are talking about monarchical power. That's what I'm talking about. So even that's why theories of popular sovereignty, as far as I'm concerned, are very problematic theories because they seem to believe that by simply pluralizing the sovereignty, you get around the problem. But when you have, when the notion of the state, particularly since Hobbes, the sovereign state as a kind of equivalent, is singularized, you cannot escape monarchical power. So the struggle of democracy in the day that including today, right, is how to do that, how to work against the perils of the one, hence that, and it's not good enough, populism or what did I say? Popular sovereignty and so on. Those notions are not adequate. Representative democracy is not adequate because it always will tend to singularize the relation and so on and so forth. And then we get into very dangerous territory. Well, what is adequate? Okay, then that's very difficult to articulate. Obviously, a certain concept of anarchy, a certain kind of radical democracy, whereby the danger of the one would always be vigilant against it. That's how I mean it. So in that sense, it's both very literal, and at the same time, a bit ahistorical. Even though I'm interested in the historical manifestations of the notion, obviously, as you can tell, a lot. But I'm not historicizing the term, right?
I wanted to press you on some of your terms.
Yeah.
And some of these maybe very
all
obvious is the distinction you wanted to make between representation and signification.
Yes,
and I'm not sure where exactly that lies.
Yes.
Although one thought I had from your talk is that signification would be something like a relation that resisted division into only two poles, whereas representation seems to imply some kind of arche and some kind of follow-on. And then the other thing, I at the beginning, you promised to talk about theatricality as
but I haven't written it. I can talk about it.
Ah, okay. I would love to hear that, and particularly because there was a moment in there, and my notes aren't good enough to recreate what you said. That you when you offered your revision of the little Schmidt dictum on the secularization of theological practices. I think you said political theater, was
no, but
the modern definitions of political theater. No.
No. I didn't. I definitely didn't say political theater, but
Or the theater of politics.
Theater of politics, maybe. But theater of politics is obviously a term that's so, it's fairly common, and it's very interesting that we don't think about it. We use it without thinking why do we use it, right? Let me, the first question, I think you put your finger in it. There seems to be, I understand, and, if we think of, I'm not thinking semiotics, obviously, when I use the term signification. Well, obviously the word sign, we can't get out of that. But I'm not thinking that way, because if I were thinking that way, then the difference would be very difficult between signification and representation. The word, I'm thinking of the word primarily coming from the French tradition, but not the semiotic one, where it is, and also the psychoanalytic tradition, where it is the process by which meaning is endowed to an object, investment in an object, which is something that does have, and this is totally arguable, but not within those discourses, not in psychoanalysis, but which does have primarily a one-directional vector, meaning it is the psyche that invests. Now, we know that no object is just simply an inert thing, and that in fact the whole point of investing in an object is that you get something out of it, get something back. So it is kind of dynamic, but it's primarily what is conferred, meaning that is conferred, as opposed to representation, which, even though it is definitely one-directional, meaning there has to be always something, an original, that is a present that is represented. Okay. What happens is that the representation itself becomes often autonomous, or ad infinitum, right? And that's that. I'm saying something actually very elementary has been discussed to death. The metaphysics of representation, and the metaphysics of representation is all over the discussion of the prohibition of images. There's no doubt about that. That's what it's about.
Can I just jump?
Yeah.
And so then it's something like this kind of magical principle that enables the representation to break free of its original is something like a principle that we could call likeness, or something that would serve as a kind of an empty indicator of some irreducible link that in fact lets the representation stand in for the...
Right. Well, it is on the one hand a kind of metaphoric, situation. But remember the reason why you want to destroy these objects of the enemy is because in some ways you're buying into their power. Why would you want to destroy them if they're really false gods? Who cares? Let them be. They're not. That is always so. There's something about the represented object. The object that represents that which cannot be represented, that definitely becomes an agent, and it's a kind of concreteness, and the reason why that's a problem for Castoriadis, and I'm just simply extrapolating, is that those things that aren't recognized to have a concreteness, right, are exempted. So words, for example, are exempted, or rituals are exempted, or sacred texts. Sacred texts are sacred texts that if you touch them, okay, wars happen over that. But no one thinks of sacred texts as idols. That would be kind of anathema. And yet, according to this argument, sacred texts are also idols. I mean, it's not a bad thing. You understand my argument? Idol is not a bad thing at all. Idolatry is not a bad thing. I'm saying that idolatry happens all around. It's constantly happening. That's not a problem. I mean, that's how human beings. We can't do without idolatry. That's my argument. And the problem is then we go into kind of historical arguments about the politics of when idolatry creates certain modes of subjugation that need to be resisted, etc. And then iconoclasm, so-called, becomes a kind of emancipatory. And then there are other times where iconoclasm is in fact subjugating and not emancipatory. And that would be entirely historical and political argument. Okay, no, it's not a philosophical argument. But I want to make sure to break the ground of this attachment to idolatry as something bad and only attached to objects. This can be linked to your second point, though it's going to be hard for me to talk about. Theatricality, okay, why am I interested in theatricality? Well, I have, God, for thousands of reasons, I've always been interested in it, but because the theater, or the language of the theater, by language here I mean literally the entire space, the performative conditions of the theater, is one of the most exciting for me domains of where the otherness that is internal, the immanent otherness, is in fact right up front and in fact necessary, right? You have to be an other in order to be in the theater. Otherwise there's no theater. You are an other. We say you play an other, but really, come on. I mean, of course you play an other, but you're, whether we don't have to get Stanislavskian, but but really, in order to play another, Brecht actually understands it very well. You really have to understand the other in yourself. I mean, therefore, be able to externalize to the audience that this is another that I'm playing, but there is really no self. I'm an actor playing, and that's Brecht's greatness. But I think so the performativity and the theatricality is a kind of I look at it as a kind of corrosive element that breaks down sort of the tendency to get comfortable around metaphysical structures. Okay, because it's all the aspects of the theater, right? It's ephemeral, it's performative, it's in your face performative. You can't really, you're part of it. You can't say I'm elsewhere. You're in it. It is, it's profoundly social. It is linked to ritual in a very kind of, again, archaic sense, etc. There's lots of things that we can talk about. But I haven't developed it yet as I want, so I can't say anything that won't sound too abstract. We can talk more about it.
And maybe come back to Will's first question about the relation of signification and representation.
That's the tough one. Yeah.
I wanted to add a third term to this, just metaphor.
Which I just used.
Discussing Schmidt and Bloomberg, of course, was a critique of Schmidt using false metaphors, or taking metaphors to be substantial realities.
Right.
So how your project would, discuss...
He's criticizing Bloomberg for
various substantial. One of them is here to substantialize metaphor, so to speak, and how your project would relate to this kind of Bloombergian...
It is, you can see...
Secularism as well.
You can see the Bloomberg here all over, I don't know how I can elaborate on that. I mean, because there's Bloomberg everywhere here, including my arguments about modernity, my argument about the human beings in kind of strange incapacity in relation to the world, those kind of anthropological things of his. Why? It's a very good time to get literary. I mean, really. I always, I'm a modernist, okay? This is really, that's why I'm trained as a modernist. So the metaphors are something really concrete. It's essential to me. There is no object. There is, of course, an object that is metaphorized, that is moved from one place to another. But this I'm talking totally elementary stuff, right? This object, as it moves, it's not the same. So the metaphor is an object, in the world. I mean, it's not. Even as just simply a linguistic idea, it's in the world. So it's not. One might then go on and say, that because this process is ultimately interminable, meaning its limits are always its own. It sets its own limits, therefore, that there is no object ever. But this is kind of radical modernism. That's what we read. It's just that's what it is. But that's that's what Kafka does. I mean, that's everything. Everything about Kafka is based on that, right? On this kind of concretization metaphor. And that one thing that one can say, almost all modernist writing. And so there's nothing here for me. I'm afraid I'm not giving you a good answer because I'm inhabiting so much that I can't quite understand, because I'm so far away from the theological language that really that sees the distance between words and things in a way that is articulated in that other sphere. So again, signification, you can see why, representation by that token would be the language that it wants to reestablish the distance between words and things. And signification is the language that shows that there is no distance between words and things. Which is to say that these two words and things, are the same word. I'm not saying that. But nor can we say that words are not things. No ideas, but in things, the classic sort of William Carlos Williams thing, right from his poem, the classic motto, we can reverse that and say, of course, no things but in ideas. So long as we keep it that way, so long as we keep it, not dialectical, but as long as we keep it that way, that's what I mean by signification. That's why it's not a semiotic. I should make that clear. It's not a semiotic analysis.
And this is an example of sort of an initial nomos to a physis, to say there are words and things. Let there be on this side, on the other side.
Yes, right. The idea that it's interesting association you made. Well, I hadn't thought of it. Yes, there is physis, there is nature. There is a substratum. There is law of gravity. Jump out the window. No, it's very low here. But whatever, you're from the 5th floor. I don't stand a chance, right? I can create ways to not parachute or have wings or get on it. But whatever, human beings find ways to deal with that. But that's the nomos part, right? There is a substratum that's we call physis that cannot be outmaneuvered, and without which, of course, we would not exist to the degree that we're physical beings. Literally biochemical beings. But that is nothing, this is nothing about us. Right? And so nomos then it's like significant. Yes, nomos is the thing that crosses physis. It isn't the law of nature.
Right.
I don't know what I'm talking about.
It's the distribution of that undifferentiated.
Right, which creates institutions. Which are necessary, obviously, for us to deal with that substratum, to build on it, actually to destroy it, which would be another way to think of it, because human beings destroy nature. This is really one of the peculiarities of this animal, that it builds, that its nomos destroys physis. That's particularly unusual and odd in the history of kind of natural beings, I think.
See, that's what entropy is, the acceleration. Life is the acceleration of entropy. So anything that lives creates higher entropy, and we're just a rather higher form of that higher entropy.
Except that we're also bizarre, wouldn't you think, in the sense that we are...
I agree with that.
that we actually reach back, or we reach in all directions, and we tamper with this stuff. From the, I know there's all these people, like these ecologists who really, make these arguments human beings are totally consequential and it makes no difference really. They are, the world will go on, and so on and so forth. I don't really know if that's true or what it means, but insofar as this particular natural being, human being exists, we see this very strange relation that we don't see with other beings in relation to physis. This is a very big discussion.
There's a wonderful discussion of Marx about the difference between bees and human beings, where it's very slight. It's a very, really sober thought.
But yet he's thinking of labor and stuff, right?
Exactly.
But
that's what.
No, this is
But I could extend this very thought to a reflection that I want to ask you about. You made it a formulation that's more precise in responding to will, and I think it captures a lot of what you're doing. I hope, and it's this that that idolatry and iconoclasm are deeply dyadic. There is a relationship between the two, and they incite each other and so forth. And that, there's never a decision. There's never an a priori decision that can be made in favor of one over the other for whatever purpose. But you also did have a criterion of the decision to be made in relationship to an iconoclasm in one point and an idolatry in the other, and that's freedom, and it's ultimately an issue of freedom. And I wonder the degree to which that is a kind of idolatry that a certain trend of thought, Levinas is one of them, Benjamin is another, and some others who actually are a little bit are far less, let's say, inclined to use the term freedom as the ultimate criteriological form. That is, well, why do it? Because of freedom. I mean, it's just...
Right. I mean, you're referring to...
And there are lots of... I mean, there's a whole constellation of thinkers who are very different from each other, and of thought developed in relationship to both liberal and German idealist forms of freedom thinking that seem, well, maybe the criterion is not liberation.
Yes, but first of all, I guess you're referring, because I didn't use the word, but you're referring to my point when I was saying that that one of the things that we have to accept by secularization is that kind of moment where people just sort of recognize that that religion is something that they've created and they can proceed without it, okay? Which I guess is a moment of freedom if we think of this, if we take the position that what I call the denial of accountability for creating religion as something that is kind of a subjugation of sorts. Yes, and it's fair to make that argument that but I didn't really use that word. And I would certainly say that freedom as a word, a concept, etc., is one of the most extraordinary idols of modernity. Okay, that liberty. I mean, yeah, so that's obvious, and I would not deny it. And that's true of democracy even. So the decision that one makes is a difficult one because since I'm kind of talking about a certain kind of anarchy, let's put it that way. I am making a political decision in a certain direction, which is to say that I'm investing. I'm kind of to use the language as much as I can from here. I'm investing in an object with a certain kind of conviction that this object will give back to me a certain condition that is freer than not. Let's not put absolutely. Okay. I agree with that. Yeah, and I recognize that there are thinkers, many of whom I really admire, and I've many really very influential thinkers, whatever, who would find real problems with that position, but it is just that at this point it's just a decision. I mean, I'm not a libertarian, clearly, I don't think, I'm certainly not fetishizing, liberty, etc. I'm profoundly anti-liberal, I'm against liberalism, that is to say, and this I've written about at length, etc., etc. But yes, I agree with you, there is that sense, there is, so at that point one could say that this is my own iconoclasm, okay, let's use again the language, at this particular moment, my iconoclastic gesture is against the idols of the idols that confine freedom to a kind of a priori problematic category. Okay, so but remember, I said that these are decisions that have to be made politically, and one of the things that is not developed here because the section on Freud is not part of it. Is really my argument about, and which is also a lot of Adorno in it. I mean, the fact that that iconoclasm in a kind of what I said desacralized universe, meaning in the context of a materialist, capitalist sort of world of commodities and so on, it's the way to kind of fight, to so as not to get caught in some kind of theological metaphysics. So this would, so long as we, and I didn't read the section on art, which would have helped. So long as we understand that we're never ever relieved of idolatry, that so long as we understand that we cannot escape idolatrous desires, okay, that's key to me. And it's okay. Okay, we have to be aware what they are. You can send me right back to Marx. What does awareness mean? I understand the loop. Yeah.
Well,
it's a difficult position.
What I was thinking about, because the term that I felt wasn't mentioned, and maybe also the tradition that you're alluding to, Peter, the arche that has been erected, and that I feel is so dominant in what you're describing, that has replaced other kinds of arches, is ethics, right? Like with Levinas, you hear the first philosophy is ethics, right? This is so. I wonder what the stakes are for you. First of all, in not framing it the discourse in those terms, and also in describing ethics as either a form of either idolatry or of iconoclasm. That move, that philosophical move that's become so popular in the last, and so central to our discourses in the last 30 years.
Well, that's a very good question.
So, that seems to me to be the idea.
No, you put your finger. I mean, I have written about this at length, and in the book, the Lessons in Secular Criticism, which were based on those lectures, Thinking Out Loud lectures, I was asked that question. I mean, it's very clear that I'm taking a position of politics over ethics, and I have no problem saying that. I understand how problematic this can be. It can perhaps even be dangerous. It's not even clear whether you can make that distinction. I understand all that, but I choose to make the distinction, and I make the distinction only on one basis. And those who are on the ethics side who don't think this is the basis, then we have a very interesting discussion. And the basis is this: that so long as ethics is practiced on entirely groundless ground, that is to say, so long as there are no ethical principles that authorize one's ethics. If an ethics can be practiced on the basis of no principles authorizing it, then that's an ethics I'm very interested in. I understand that it's terrifying. It's because that means it's an open game and all kinds of things can happen. But in a sense, my argument would be then that is what really raises the stakes and the responsibility of decision and accountability. Right? That's when accountability and responsibility, those words that are very important to Derrida, obviously, and Levinas, etc., and others, and they are important to me as well. That's when the stakes are highest. When there is utter abyssal, there's groundlessness, no foundation, right? So in that sense, I'm against obviously any kind of Kantian transcendentalist ethics, and even my Marxism here would obviously not be applicable, clearly, as I mentioned in the very first answer to Peter's question. Whatever Marxism there is, that it has to be wary of its tendency to theology, and so on. But you're right about, I didn't mention it here, but it's all over here. I mean, you're right to see it, and I have discussed it openly and directly. And it is everywhere in my writing. I didn't want to pick a fight with ethics here, and that's not quite the point. I mean, I have these very wonderful discussions and arguments with many of my friends over these issues, and I understand the danger of it. I really do. But I feel that we have to try to think in those terms. We have to try to figure out how to think in those terms. I don't know how, but I mean, I'm trying. But we have to try to figure out how to think in those terms, including the dangers. That's why democracy is so important to me. I teach all that. I tell my students, there's nothing good or bad about democracy. Democracy is not a good thing. It could be a terrible thing, an absolutely horrible thing. But it's also not horrible because it's horrible. It just can become horrible. It is, though, the as far as I'm concerned, the most, I want to say the best, but you know what I mean? The most apt mode of dealing with this kind of a groundlessness. If we're really going to take it seriously, where there are no transcendental principles authorizing your politics. Your politics really are made on, right here and now, together with the others, obviously, who also do the same, etc., etc. And therefore, this politics is unpredictable and perilous. And it does actually, so we know that from history. And also it doesn't last, we also know that from history. So, I don't know what else I can say beyond that, but that's